Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Readout. Today we are checking out malicious compliance. Story 1. The unintended cost of stupid corporate travel policies. I used to fly a lot for work. My record year was more than 250,000 miles on just my favorite airline. Then the company I worked for was bought by another company with a much more restrictive, actually oppressive, travel policy. We could only book coach class with the new company and it couldn't be more than $100 over the cheapest airline serving a particular airport. I would usually fly out of FLL, PBI, or MCO. And only once in a blue moon MLB. With the new policy I was pretty much forced to use Southwest, Spirit, Frontier, and the likes. And this is now where MLB was standing out. After the big financial crash in 2008 there was only one airline left in MLB for many years and that was Delta, which happened to be my favorite airline. So instead of a $600 ticket on Delta out PBI, because there was a $400 on one of the cheap airlines, I followed the travel policy and booked a $1,400 coach ticket out of MLB. Our travel policy also did not allow us to book first class. When you travel on short notice, however, it is quite possible that there is discounted first class still available while all the remaining coach seats are full fare. In other words, the first class ticket is cheaper than the coach ticket. So I would make sure I book my flight in compliance with the corporate travel policy and then contact the airline to adjust my booking, turning that expensive coach seat into a first class seat plus getting the difference in Delta dollars. Too bad our corporate policy required us to also book non-refundable fares, lol. That is what happens when a grumpy bean counter creates a corporate travel policy. Later they wanted us to only book through Amex travel service so that Amex would enforce the policy. More than once I heard. Story 2. You want me to come into work while I'm sick? Sure. This occurred late January this year. I was just laughing about it with a friend who said I should post it here. Smiley face. Earlier this year I was doing bar work at a small local pub after college. Anyway, over the weekend I'd been helping out at the scout group and through a combo of too much shouting through woods and a rather stressful week of family arguments I slowly and then pretty much completely lost my voice. Sunday evening came and I realized there was no way it'd come back for Monday, so I sent my boss a text and email to inform him that I wouldn't be in work tomorrow night and why. Monday comes and I get through college, sending him a reminder email and text before 10 a.m. as is policy. Around 7 p.m., my shift started at 6:30, I received a call from an angry head chef/boss asking my whereabouts. I had to pass the phone to my sister to talk for me. He then texted me demanding that I come into work. I decided, you know what, I will, but customers won't be happy. Went in and sorted the bar and it wasn't long until problems started. First couple of customers just wanted some pints pulled, so no need for me to really converse other than motioning at the amount due for payment. Then a group of already tipsy women wanted a few gins and wines. I couldn't ask them what they wanted or let them know what we had other than gesturing and scribbling on a notepad. This group contained a particularly vocal Karen and she had a reputation. She began harassing me and then turned her attention to the chef's mum as she walked past carrying a food order. She immediately noticed me at the bar, did a double take and a glance of "you shouldn't be here." She then more or less ordered me home. I ended up with a full shift's pay for 10 minutes of actually being there and was let off until my voice returned. A week and a half later one of the serving staff told me about the aftermath. Chef's mum had fetched chef from the kitchen and had given him a good telling off in the bar area in front of customers. This wasn't the first time he'd tried to force staff to come in when they were ill. She also had him personally deal with Karen. Story 3. I guess we will just have to take more then. To start off, I understand this situation is shitty for the landowners, but their unwillingness to work with us made everything worse for them. Last fall, my team was designing a roadway widening on a secondary evacuation route in prime hurricane territory. As we were doubling the number of lanes, we had to claim additional right-of-way, R/W, from the property owners on the route. In order to minimize the amount of land we had to claim, we only proposed taking the minimum amount of R/W possible, which was to the top of the back slope of the proposed drainage ditches. This was not sufficient to cover all work being done, so we had to request slope permissions and erosion control permissions from the landowners, saying that they would retain the land, however we would be allowed to impact the land during construction. There were approximately 80 properties which were affected during this process, and all but one set of property owners were willing to work without our/W acquisition team. The last owners were losing approximately 1 acre of land along their 3,000-foot property bordering the road, and we were going to include about 5,000 SF of slope permissions. We acquisition reached out to them, they were told in no uncertain terms, never contact the property owners again. Legally, we had to reach out again, and acquisition was sworn at pretty severely during this call. As they were unwilling to work with us, we only had one option, move for condemnation, and considering they made it clear that they would be unwilling to work with us in the future if need arose during construction, we had to take 20 of additional R/W for the entire length of their project, more than doubling the amount of profit they lost. So, their refusal to work with us ended up costing them much more land than they wished. I get it, it is shitty that the government is going to come in and compel you to sell your land, but we were trying to reduce the impact to your property as much as possible. Couple points. Acquired R/W is paid out at assessed market price, regardless of whether there is an agreement of if the legal process of condemnation must be taken. This happened in a rural area, and none of the parcels were residential. The one in question is nearly 300 acres and, like many of the properties in the area, is primarily used as a private hunting area. Story 4. VP demands every line of code reviewed. I complied. Chaos ensued. I was a software developer at a mid-sized tech firm. The company had recently hired a new VP of development, Mark, who was keen to make a name for himself by implementing strict coding standards. Mark's rules were unnecessarily rigid and often counterproductive. One such rule was that every single line of code, no matter how trivial, needed to be documented and reviewed by him personally before deployment. He sent this directive out in a Slack message to the entire development team. Sensing that this could lead to trouble, I took a screenshot of the message. I, along with several colleagues, tried to reason with Mark, explaining that this approach would stifle innovation and slow down the development process immensely. But Mark was unyielding, convinced that his way would produce flawless code. Seeing no other option, I decided to maliciously comply. Over the next several weeks, I wrote extensive documentation for every line of code, even for the most self-explanatory functions. Simple changes that used to take a few minutes now took hours, as everything had to be sent to Mark for review. Mark's days were consumed by reviewing mundane code, and his other responsibilities began to suffer. Projects were delayed, deadlines were missed, and costs began to skyrocket as everything came to a screeching halt. Eventually, Mark came to me, clearly annoyed, and accused me of over-interpreting his rule to cause delays. Calmly, I pulled up the screenshot of his original Slack message and showed him that I was only following his exact instructions. He was taken aback but had no choice but to acknowledge that I had complied precisely with his rule. Shortly after, the CEO took notice of the delays and launched an investigation. When he discovered Mark's overbearing review process, he was livid. One of the delayed projects was a critical update for a major client, and the hold-up had cost the company a lucrative contract extension. This loss could be traced directly back to Mark's policy. Mark was promptly fired, and his rule was abolished. TLDR, new VP implemented a rigid code review rule, causing delays. I followed it to the letter, leading to lost contracts and his eventual firing. Story 5. Strict adherence to contract backfires beautifully. Had to share this gem of a story from a few years back when I was contracting with a tech firm. Get your popcorn, because this one's a treat. Enter Mr. Grayson, the firm's new operations head. Now, this guy had a reputation for being a stickler for rules, often to the point of absurdity. Shortly after his arrival, contractors like myself were handed these freshly inked contracts. It was verbose, to say the least. But one clause stood out: all contractors shall adhere strictly to the tasks outlined in their contract. Any deviation will result in immediate termination. This was Mr. Grayson's baby, his attempt to ensure we stayed in our designated lanes. For context, the firm had a history of a collaborative environment. Developers would occasionally assist with design queries, and designers, like me, would sometimes offer input on usability to the developers. But Grayson, oh, he wanted none of that cross-departmental nonsense. Now, on to the malicious compliance. A big project was on the horizon, and midway, the development team hit a snag. They identified a design flaw, something my team could have fixed in an hour or two. However, helping them wasn't in my contract. So, I sat back, sipped my coffee, and watched the drama unfold. The developers, bound by their contracts, spent days trying to engineer their way around a problem that wasn't theirs to solve. The project timeline got stretched, costs increased, and frustrations bubbled. The climax? A big meeting with higher UPS where Grayson had to explain the delays. When the design flaw was brought up, all eyes turned to me. I simply slid a copy of my contract across the table and highlighted the strict adherence clause. I recall the deafening silence in the room, broken only by Grayson's stammering. In the aftermath, Grayson's strict contract idea was trashed. Collaboration resumed, the project got back on track. Dear Mr. Grayson? He was reassigned to a different department, far away from meddling with contracts. Dr. New operations head enforces strict contracts preventing collaboration. A minor hiccup in a project leads to major delays, highlighting the absurdity of the rules. Operations head gets a metaphorical pie in the face and a new assignment. Story 6. The Star-Spangled Banner. Back around 1970 I was stationed at Pearl Harbor at a submarine base weapons shop in the U.S. Navy. The shop had its own calibration lab, which I, as an enlisted non-commissioned officer, managed. We were all on a 6-day duty rotation that meant I had to be on duty in the shop for 24 hours straight, despite weather, weekends, or anything else that might arise once every 6 days. On this particular Saturday afternoon/evening I was there on my 24-hour duty day, and as coincidence would have it, my shop commanding officer was celebrating his promotion to Lieutenant JG. Therefore, I was assigned to help set up for the party, which would take place in a large equipment bay, perhaps 50 by 100. The cement floor had to be mopped, waxed, and polished, tables set up, etc. Since the shop PA system equipment was located in my calibration lab, one part of my duties was to plug it into a local radio station playing appropriate music. After completing the rest of the setup work, as a finishing touch, I set up the PA system and tuned it to an easy listening radio station suitable for senior officers and their wives. Picture in your mind something similar to the Camp PA system in Moss*H. I then made myself suitably socially invisible for the duration of the party, alone in my lab, as the party commenced. A little later on I found myself in the presence of said commanding officer who ordered me to find a somewhat more lively and with it radio station. I was more than happy to oblige. I tuned the radio to the local hippie FM station. Remember that it's 1970, where the DJs often fell asleep or passed out between songs due to certain recreational chemicals. But they did play lively music like Santana, Janis Joplin, Led Zeppelin, etc. To put the exclamation point on this instance of malicious compliance, I then called the radio station, KPOI, whose call letters will forever be etched in my memory, and requested they play the national anthem by Jimi Hendrix. I peeked out of my lab just in time to see a gaggle of naval officers trying to decide whether to stand at attention and salute, or come after me with their ceremonial sabers. Cooler heads prevailed and I was simply asked to find a more suitable station. I did later get a one-on-one with my commanding officer about malicious compliance wherein I feigned complete astonishment that things went so wrong. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.